Checkmate by Kevin Baldeosingh, Trinidad. The bank teller looked like a sensible woman. She wore spectacles with sensible black wire frames. Her black hair was tied back in a sensible bun unstreaked by red or blonde highlights. Even her stocky figure in her gray bank uniform looked sensible. But she was not making any sense. Sukiya heard the words like a foreign language as the teller repeated her question, "Miss Chansing, do you want the $30 million deposited in your savings account, or would you prefer to open a US dollar account?" Sukiya glanced around the banking hall. She had deliberately not come to the branch where she had her savings account, because the staff there would be too familiar with her business. She was in the special queue for customers who held platinum credit cards. There were just two people behind her, but they were not close enough to hear what the teller was saying. The other queue, for ordinary customers, had 22 people standing between the velvet ropes which hung like sleeping snakes between stainless steel stanchions. At the head of that line, a man in a green khaki shirt and black trousers stood with his brown leather shoes just touching red tape on the polished marble floor. An orange arrow on the bank counter's electronic strip lit up, and the man moved toward a wicket on the far side of the counter. But not US $5 million. Even with the bribe which the Chinese considered protocol in such deals. Sukiya drummed her fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. It was now the lunch hour and the traffic had already slowed to a crawl as those office workers with vehicles in assigned parking spaces headed like so many beetles to restaurants outside the city to have lunch. The traffic was worse these days because of the skyscrapers being built on the waterfront property of the island's main harbor. Sleek glass and steel towers that, even before completion, glowed with pastel-colored liner lights during the night. 21 people in the line now, 9 at the counter, 4 in the line for commercial transactions, and 3 in the special line, a total of 37 customers. Sukiya's tally was automatic and effortless. She counted everything, which was why the teller standing in front of her was making no sense at all. Was it some kind of joke? Sukiya looked at the woman, who was gazing expectantly back at her. She did not seem to be joking, but if she was, Sukiya would write a formal complaint to the manager. Perhaps she should have been talking to the manager in the first place. But, from the day she was appointed corporate secretary of the company and got a tenfold salary raise, Sukiya had decided that she would not deal with any bank managers, even though she was now among the country's 1% of highest income earners. Her official tax-deductible salary was standard for top executives. The $50,000 went automatically into her savings account on the 28th day of every month. But that money did not show her real income, which was how Randall had advised her to arrange her finances. Sukiya only used that savings account to pay the mortgage on her 2-bedroom apartment on the island and related monthly bills, mainly utilities. The rest of the money just accumulated. The company paid for gas and servicing of her SUV, an Audi Q7. She ate out for most meals, including breakfast, which she usually had at the hotel across the road from the company's headquarters at 7 every morning except Sunday. And for every other expense, even hairstyling and shoes, she used the company credit card. Her savings account now had just over $7 million in it. She had become the company's corporate secretary 6 years ago, but had been working there for 15 years. In the first decade, when she had just been one of several in-house lawyers, her savings had never crossed $10,000. Now, she deposited 5 times that amount every month in that same account, which she had opened when she was 18 years old and was working as a store clerk. This was the reason why, after her promotion, Sukiya had decided never to deal personally with the bank manager, as most customers in her new income bracket did. A bank manager might wonder how a $50,000 a month salary became $7 million in savings within 6 years, and he would know enough to make some educated guesses. An ordinary teller, on the other hand, would know little about how rich people conducted their business. She would see Sukiya's salary and record the checks that she came in with every few months to deposit. But at most, the teller would just be envious that this woman was earning hundreds of times more money than she made as a bank clerk. Except, now, Sukiya was facing one of those very tellers and feeling a flutter in her stomach. She said, "What you mean?" then stopped. She took a breath to make sure her voice was steady and, making sure to pronounce each word properly, said, "I don't understand what you mean." "That check is for $5 million. The teller nodded. "Yes, Miss Chansing. It's for $5 million US. If you're depositing the check in your savings account, I just have to contact our Treasury Department to get exchange rate approval. But it should be about 30,242,000 Trinidad and Tobago dollars." She gestured with the check and Sukiya almost flinched. "Or would you like to open a US dollar account?" The teller, in her sensible bank uniform with her sensible hairstyle, began to recite the benefits of a US account for that sum of money. But Sukiya, aghast at her own carelessness, barely heard her. A US dollar check. She would not have made such a mistake 16 years ago, when she was just a 25-year-old attorney fresh out of law school. She would not have made it 7 years ago, when she finally completed her degree in accounting. The same year her father had died from kidney failure at San Fernando General Hospital, where there were only 2 dialysis machines. He had not known that Sukiya was studying accounts, or that she had been making enough money to put him in a private clinic, or, even if she had wanted, send him to Pakistan for a new kidney. Now, she had actually tossed a multi-million-dollar check into her desk drawer without reading the figure properly. It had been her responsibility to move vast sums through various channels when the oil and gas boom started and the money began flowing into the company. It was not the kind of mistake she had ever made before. "Gimme the check," Sukiya told the teller. The woman's eyes widened a little. Had her tone been too abrupt? "Please," she added. The teller slid the check across the counter. Sukiya picked it up, the serrated edge familiar against her fingertips, and scanned the black ink stamped immutably into the heavy paper. $5 million US, made out in her name, signed Randall A.R. Credo with the firm downstroke on the R and the large loop on the C, countersigned by herself in her neat and precise handwriting. She had not even looked when she had signed it, partly because the check had been part of a rushed session 1 week ago in which she had signed off 47 different documents with Randall. But that was no excuse. She had made a mistake, and she never made mistakes. There was just one person in the line behind Sukiya now. 33 people in the line for ordinary bank accounts, 6 in the commercial queue, 40 customers, not including herself. None of the women was as well dressed as Sukiya, and she had seen some of them glancing at her Burberry skirt and Dolce blouse and Manolo Blahnik pumps. Sukiya had intended to go back to the office after finishing her business in the bank, but now she was worried. It was 12 minutes until noon, and then there would be more customers and the banking hall would be nearly full because the ordinary accounts line would stretch from counter to door. She wanted to be out of the bank before that happened. But she could not deposit the $5 million, or rather the $30,242,000 into her local account. It was not just because all her U.S. checks went to the Cayman Islands account, which was the money she used to invest and to pay the mortgage on her London flat. Randall had inherited his company long before electronic banking was standard, and he had watched too many movies where unrealistically cunning criminals cleaned out businessmen's offshore bank accounts by hacking into them. So he preferred to do these payments in paper. But Sukiya did not know why Randall had given her this $5 million. She could not deposit it until she had spoken to him. But would the teller get suspicious if she took the check back? She looked at the woman again. The frames of her spectacles were inexpensive. She wore a wedding ring, but the diamond was small and standard cut. The skin on her face was very smooth, though she was not unusually pretty. The other 7 checks Sukiya had given her were heaped in a little stack. Sukiya would have laid them out so she could scan all the details in one glance. No, she decided. The woman had no inkling of how to finance really worked. "You could tell me." Sukiya paused, drawing another breath. "Could you tell me the amounts of those checks?" The figures ran automatically through her head. 67,000 last September, 129,000 inches November, 2,000 inches December, 246,000 inches January, 400,000 inches April, 322,000 inches May, and 600,000 inches August. She had gotten the 5 million check last Tuesday, which she had assumed was her fee for the contract she had drawn up for Randall to sell the methanol plant. So she had decided that she should go to the bank and deposit all the checks in the drawer before they added up to real money. The teller took up the 7 checks and flipped through them top to bottom as she read out the dates and totals. Sukiya wanted those 7 amounts to sync and to make sure that she had not, somehow, made another mistake. But the sums the teller called out matched the numbers in Sukiya's head. The total was $1,840,000. It was not much money in the real world, just about $300,000 US, or 215,000 euros, or 180,000 pounds sterling, but Sukiya knew she should not have let it pile up like that. It was just that she hated going to the bank, joining lines of people to deposit pieces of trivial paper when she usually sat in her office and dealt with real money on the computer. "Okay," she told the teller, "put those in my account. I will open a US savings account as you advised, but I don't have time now. I could come back later?" "Of course, Miss Chansing," the teller said. "We're closing at 2 today, though. I'll come back tomorrow to see about that then. What time you open? Do you open?" "At 8. And you'll need to provide the source of funds, of course." "Of course," Sukiya said, biting down a pleased smile at this confirmation that the teller had no idea how really rich people conducted their business. She waited patiently while the teller signed off the 7 checks and, after punching the figures into her computer, printed out a deposit slip which she handed to Sukiya. "I've confirmed the company account and cleared your checks so you have access to the funds," she said. "Thank you for your help." Sukiya answered and left the bank, where she now counted a total of 55 customers. As she walked back to the car park, she felt pleased at how she had handled that potentially awkward encounter. People were difficult to read, not like numbers, but she had distracted the teller, took charge of her, and then made her feel that she had done a good job. Sukiya's only criticism of herself was her occasional lapse into the countryside accent of her upbringing. But even there she had caught herself before the teller could glean where Sukiya was from. Besides, the teller was not in her class now. If Sukiya really had opened a US dollar account for the tuition, she supposed the teller would get some kind of boost in her performance evaluation, maybe even a promotion. What would that be worth to her? Maybe an extra $2,000 a month? A $5,000 bonus at the end of the year? Sukiya smiled as she pressed the unlock button on her key remote and climbed into the SUV. She could have been like that teller, but she had worked hard and found a way to leave the poverty she had been born into. The teller might even have a life insurance policy with the company. More than 1/3 of the island's population did. Sukiya pressed her forefinger to the electronic ignition and fastened her seatbelt as the engine hummed to life, thinking that, statistically, 33% of the customers in the ordinary accounts line had paid for her Audi. But they had not paid the US $5 million now sitting in her wallet. That must have come from the Chinese, though Sukiya did not know why. She settled into the leather seat, the air conditioning creating an autumnal cocoon against the shimmering tropical heat outside, and pulled out of the crowded car park. She would have to go to her apartment before she headed back to the office. She needed to check her private records before she saw Randall, and she wanted to change her clothes. She had no meeting scheduled today, so she had dressed for style. But if she was to meet Randall, she wanted to be wearing a more formal outfit. It was, Sukiya had learned long ago, necessary for a woman, even if she had known her boss and his secrets for so many years. The company also had shares in every major media house on the island, so no reporter would be looking for a scandal there, and even if one did, no editor would let it be published for fear of a backlash from the advertising department or, worse, their board of directors. She wondered if Randall himself had made an error by giving her this check. Perhaps, in that exercise which had taken them the entire morning, he had confused one payment with another. Had he seemed distracted? She did not think so. He had worked with his usual fierce concentration, discussing the various points of each transaction succinctly and quickly, and the only interruption in their intense flow was trivial. When his pen had run out of ink as he was signing documents and he had borrowed her 18th carat Tibaldi rollerball and, Sukiya only now realized, had forgotten to give it back. And the thought popped automatically into her head, as inevitable as the logic of 2 + 2 = 4. Should she just not mention the check to Randall and deposit it into her Cayman account? Sukiya played with this possibility for several minutes as she waited for the traffic light to change. Even for her, $5 million was a substantial sum. She could use the money to renovate her London flat, or she could buy the adjacent unit in her Miami condominium and convert the place into a 3-bedroom space. Or, for just $14 million TT, she could buy a 6-bedroom house with a swimming pool and a gazebo. As the lights turned green and Sukiya pulled out into the 3-lane main road out of the city, she decided against depositing the check without consulting Randall. Her London and Miami properties were good investments, and she would get her mother's modest 3-bedroom flat when she died. Besides, wealthy as he was, even Randall did not throw around checks for that amount, and she, as corporate secretary and his private accountant, would have known about such a sum too. He did not have her foolproof mind for calculations, but he could look at a row of numbers in an income statement, or a balance sheet, or an equity statement, and instantly know what they meant. He did not need to calculate, he just knew intuitively if the figures were off, if they concealed something, or what they meant as a transaction. Sukiya respected this ability, although she had rejected her mathematical gift in favor of law, because lawyers earned more than accountants, and because her father had been an accounts clerk, who, when Sukiya at 17 years had won the national scholarship that provided the money for her to go to university, had celebrated by getting even more drunk and beating her mother more viciously than usual. But Randall, whose father had been one of the country's leading businessmen, had a similar ability for law as for accounts. Sukiya, as corporate secretary, drew up contracts, studied conveyances, and wrote legal opinions, and she knew all the requirements for such documents. Randall could read the documents and see the potential loopholes. When she had first been promoted, Sukiya thought Randall had hired her to close such loopholes. Instead, she got her largest checks for creating them. The sale of the methanol company to the Chinese government had been a standard contract, however, and that was the only task she had done for which she could be paid a large sum. But Randall, whose father had been one of the country's leading businessmen, had a similar ability for law as for accounts. Sukiya, as corporate secretary, drew up contracts, studied conveyances, and wrote legal opinions, and she knew all the requirements for such documents. Randall could read the documents and see the potential loopholes. When she had first been promoted, Sukiya thought Randall had hired her to close such loopholes. Instead, she got her largest checks for creating them. The sale of the methanol company to the Chinese government had been a standard contract, however, and that was the only task she had done for which she could be paid a large sum. But not $5 million, even with the bribe which the Chinese considered protocol in such deals. Sukiya drummed her fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. It was now the lunch hour, and the traffic had already slowed to a crawl, as those office workers with vehicles and assigned parking spaces headed like so many beetles to restaurants outside the city to have lunch. The traffic was worse these days because of the skyscrapers being built on the waterfront property of the island's main harbor, sleek glass and steel towers that, even before completion, glowed with pastel-colored liner lights during the night. These buildings were the Prime Minister's pet project, and he was using the new inflow of oil and gas dollars to change the city's skyline to a facade of Miami's. Randall was a major campaign contributor, so the company had gotten several contracts for the construction, and Sukiya usually did not mind the traffic since she had bought her Q7. She liked the vehicle's high vantage point and the fact that there were very few Audi SUVs on the road and the quietness of the engine. But, most of all, Sukiya liked that no one could see her through the windows, which were tinted far darker than the legal limit. The traffic police would know they would be wasting their time charging anyone who drove a vehicle which cost more than an ordinary person's home. Today, though, none of these thoughts calmed her. She needed to find out if any mistake had been made, and she needed to get to her apartment so she could be fully prepared when she met Randall. She took out her iPhone and opened the organizer to check the day's schedule. Randall had meetings all afternoon at the office, so he would be there. She had known that. She pressed the home button and said, enunciating each syllable, "Secretary Margaret." When Randall's executive assistant answered her call, Sukiya told her to open a 10-minute slot for her before 2 o'clock. Margaret asked if 1:30 would be convenient, and Sukiya said yes. She did not think it would take longer than that to clarify the matter, and Sukiya suddenly decided, if there had been a mistake which was not her fault, she was quite sure she could persuade Randall to let her keep the check. After all, the sale to the Chinese had taken a lot of work and had been very profitable, and Randall had been able to pocket a sum of money which made the check in Sukiya's purse look like spare change. When Randall's executive assistant answered her call, Sukiya told her to open a 10-minute slot for her before 2 o'clock. Margaret asked if 1:30 would be convenient, and Sukiya said yes. She did not think it would take longer than that to clarify the matter, and Sukiya suddenly decided, if there had been a mistake which was not her fault, she was quite sure she could persuade Randall to let her keep the check. After all, the sale to the Chinese had taken a lot of work and had been very profitable, and Randall had been able to pocket a sum of money which made the check in Sukiya's purse look like spare change. Getting up with a slight grunt, Sukiya selected a key from her key ring and unlocked her study. The maids were never allowed in there, even when she was present. The room also had 2 filing cabinets and a computer desk with an ergonomic office chair. Cardboard folders and plastic binders were piled everywhere, and there was dust on the computer keyboard. Sukiya sat in the chair and pulled open a desk drawer. There were 10 checks inside, which she laid out neatly on the desktop. She took the one out of her wallet and placed it at the center of the square of checks. She had gotten these checks over a 3-month period. In all, they totaled US $12 million. It was Randall's fault that she had almost made the mistake with this new one. He insisted on paying for her extra duties involving foreign firms with US checks. So every 2 months, Sukiya had to fly from Trinidad to Grand Cayman to deposit them into her account there. But then she had also started hoarding the TT dollar checks, which were paid on the side for tasks involving local transactions. Sukiya found it onerous to deposit those checks regularly, and months would drag on before she reached the local bank. She realized that there was an element of vanity in this. She took pleasure in the fact that she, a poor girl from Penal, was now so prosperous that she could let millions of dollars accumulate in her desk. She told herself she should be more sensible. It was just money after all, but Randall had not gotten where he was by being financially careless. Sukiya switched on her computer, logged into her encrypted folder. The folder contained the last 5 years of company transactions. She had done 6 for Randall since she had been appointed 6 years ago. The new one would take her to the $12 million mark. She went to the last transaction, the methanol plant sale. Her fee was a standard 1.5%. That worked out to just over 5 million TT dollars. She checked the list of side payments. They were all there in the contracts she had drawn up. But the new post-it was not there. Sukiya frowned. Was it possible she had missed something? But the figures were on her computer screen. The files were on her desk. She checked the online records on the company's server. They were all the same. So there was no extra payment. The $5 million was not a payment for any work Sukiya had done, nor a bonus. Randall had told her that the company had a new policy where no bonuses were to be paid to top executives until they achieved their 5-year goals. So the check was not for her at all. She would have to give it back. The thought was unexpectedly depressing. She had already been making plans, the 6-bedroom house with the pool, and she was sure Randall would have let her keep it. She was, after all, his most trusted employee. He was fond of telling her that he thought of her as the daughter he never had. And, she thought suddenly, he treated her the way he would have treated a son. This was the probable reason for the check. Randall was grooming her. It was a test. A loyalty test. Randall was not a man to pay lip service. He would expect a return on his word. She wondered if he had been disappointed that she had not come to him immediately after leaving the bank. Sukiya looked around her study, her gaze resting on her 2 accounting and law degrees in their simple wooden frames on the wall. Randall would have been surprised at her hesitation if he knew. She had already decided what to do. She went to her closet, a small room with an entire wall that was a mirror. She took off her clothes, hung them up carefully, and stood in front of the mirror, turning this way and that to assess her figure. She was pleased. She did her regular yoga and gym exercises, and her stomach was flat. She would have to go on a diet soon, though. She did not like to see even a hint of fat on her hips. Sukiya never wore very expensive clothes. She thought it foolish to spend a lot of money on items which, however good, wore out. But she did buy expensive shoes and business suits. She now went through her collection of pantsuits and chose a gray one from Armani. She dressed slowly, taking pleasure in the ritual. She put her hair up in its usual bun, checked herself in the mirror again, then went to the small safe in her closet. She knew the combination by heart, her parents' wedding anniversary. She took out a plain silver bracelet and a single-strand pearl necklace. Then Sukiya went to the cabinet where she kept her stationery. On a plain white letter-sized sheet, she wrote her resignation. Sukiya went to the cabinet. 1. Disrupted her day. And then, as she stood over the desk frowning, Sukiya saw what was wrong with them. She heard her breath gasp from her throat, as though from someone else. She closed her eyes for several seconds and then looked down again at the rectangles of paper neatly arranged on her desk. She still saw what she had seen, like the hidden shape in a collection of dots. There was no mistake, which meant that Randall Credo was either clinically insane or even more cunning than she had thought. Sukiya felt the tension in her thighs and knees and realized that she was trying to stop her legs from buckling. She carefully rolled the office chair back and sat down. She ran light, unsteady fingers over the checks. Options clicked through her mind like the various clauses she put into contracts to achieve certain ends or to prevent the other party from achieving certain ends. But she knew that there were really only 2 options: confront Randall or run away. She could run away. She had more than enough money. But she had more than enough money for several years now. To run away would mean she could no longer be a player in the most important game. Sukiya stood up. She gathered up all the checks and put them into the manila envelope. Her hands were steady now. She would go and meet Randall for their 1:30 meeting. She only hoped that he was just insane. The trip back into the capital city took just 10 minutes. Sukiya used that time to plan her strategy. She parked in her space in the company car park. It was 1:15. She sat in her Q7. She did not want to go to Randall's office and be kept waiting because she was early. That would put her in a position of weakness. Nor did she want to arrive late, for Randall insisted on punctuality. She waited until 1:29, then took the elevator to the top floor, walking into Randall's outer office at exactly 1:29. The secretary, Margaret, was at her desk, as always. Sukiya raised her eyebrows at Randall's door. Margaret nodded and said, "I opened a slot as you requested. He's expecting you." Margaret was a middle-aged woman with a little girl lilt in her voice. She always wore low-heeled shoes and straight skirts that reached below her knees. She had been Randall's secretary even before he inherited the company. Despite having no formal skills except typing and shorthand, she now functioned as Randall's executive assistant and actually had her own secretary to deal with routine duties. Margaret's office was bigger than Sukiya's, but Sukiya put this down to architectural necessity since the office was really Randall's. Yet Margaret was also paid more than most managers in the company's subsidiaries, and Sukiya felt this was because the woman knew more about Randall's dealings than anyone else in the company, including Sukiya herself. She knocked on Randall's door and heard his usual gruff, "Come in." Sukiya entered, holding the manila envelope tightly in her hand. Randall was sitting behind his oak desk, examining some files. His office was huge and light and airy, with large rectangular plate glass windows set deep into the wall. The office contained a small conference table at one end and had a sofa set in a corner. Randall was dressed as usual, in a suit which looked one size too small for his stocky frame. He did not smile to greet her. Randall's face was not shaped for smiling, and the best he ever did was a slight stretch of the lips. In its casual brutality, his visage always reminded Sukiya of the unforgiving god masks of certain Amerindian tribes. He had a wide but tight-lipped mouth, a thick nose, and a hard chin. Only Randall's light brown eyes would have been attractive, except for his habitually sharp gaze. "What can I do for you, Sukiya?" Randall never wasted time on small talk, which was a habit that he and Sukiya shared. She pulled the check out of her purse and dropped it on the desk. "I don't know what this is for." Randall picked it up. His fingers were thick, with black hairs on the backs of the joints. He examined the check for several seconds. "I was wondering if you would query this or just deposit it," he said. "When I didn't hear from you for 1 week, I assumed you'd deposited it. What's it for?" "On the books, it's your fee for the methanol deal." "And off the books?" "Off the books, it's your fee for keeping your mouth shut about the methanol deal." Sukiya folded her arms. "Why do I need to keep my mouth shut, Randall?" "I drew up a standard contract." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a plastic-covered folder. "This is a valuation report for the shares. The contract you drew up undervalues those shares by 50%. Sukiya blinked. "I used the share price you told me to use." Randall opened the folder to the last page and pointed to a signature at the bottom. "You've gotten into the habit of signing documents without reading them properly, Sukiya." Sukiya's lips tightened. She understood now. This was why the Chinese had offered such a huge kickback. Randall had offered them the methanol plant at below value, but if anyone found out about the valuation, it could be the basis for fraud charges. She said, "Your signature's there too." Randall shrugged. "I didn't write the contract." Sukiya opened the flap on the manila envelope. "You've acquired some peculiar signing habits too, Randall." She shook out the checks and laid them in front of him. Randall looked down at the slips of paper and then did what Sukiya thought he would never do. He smiled. His smile was a tight curve of the lips and he showed no teeth, but there was genuine pleasure in it. Finally, he said. The nervousness Sukiya felt in the bank that morning had merely caused a flutter in her stomach. Now she felt as though her stomach was a cold, tight ball. Her mouth had gone dry. She drew a deep breath and kept her voice steady. "Your signatures on these checks don't match. Each one looks different. Only that one," she nodded at the $5 million check at the center, "is written in your normal hand." Randall's smile became even wider, but his teeth were still covered by his lips. "Actually, it's only close to my normal hand. Apparently, someone in this office had access to blank checks and forged my signature. Even the signature on this check, which, as you say, is quite close to mine, was written with your pen." He pulled out her Tibaldi rollerball from his inside pocket. "It's quite a nice pen." Sukiya licked her lips. "What are you up to, Randall?" He gestured to his desk, which was covered with files, reports, and business magazines. "This universe is collapsing. Sukiya and its masters cannot hold." Sukiya sucked in her teeth. Randall's habit of uttering cryptic statements had always annoyed her, and she was in no mood to decipher. "What does that mean?" "It means, Sukiya, that this company will be bankrupt within 3 months." The shimmer from the giant windows seemed to become stronger, as though the light had begun to vibrate. Sukiya leaned forward, resting the palms of her hands on Randall's desk. "We can't be bankrupt. We're one of the biggest conglomerates in the region." Now Randall showed his teeth as he laughed, and Sukiya's stomach clenched even tighter. "I think there's going to be a worldwide financial crisis before the year is finished. You might not see that, you don't pay attention to the world. But you've been moving this company's assets around for years. You know our finances better than anyone. You didn't see it coming?" "I did what you told me to do," she said. "And why have you forged your own signature on your own checks?" Randall shrugged. "Just protecting myself. When the storm breaks, I'll be in its eye. The checks are just one strategy." The managers, the board, yourself, well, let's just say that none of the documents the authorities will come for implicate me. You're the boss. You'll be held accountable. She spoke more vehemently than she had intended. I may be held responsible, Randall answered, but there'll be nothing to hold me accountable. He rolled her pen like a propeller between his fingers. A crucial difference. And then what Sukiya had never let happen in her whole professional career happened. Her eyes grew hot and prickly, and tears sprouted onto her cheeks. Randall watched her curiously. Relax, Sukiya. You may have to go to court, but the police here don't have the technical know how to make a case for financial transgressions. Sukiya wiped her wet face with the back of her hand. After a few moments, she said, If we collapse, that affects every person who has a life insurance policy with us. That means votes. That means the government will hire American forensic auditors, probably even British QCs, to prosecute the case. Randall nodded. There is that possibility. Sukiya leaned forward, her white knuckles pressed into the hard oak of Randall's desk. I've always been loyal to you. Randall cut her off. You were certainly paid enough to be loyal. Sukiya breathed deeply, and she saw Randall's eyes shift to her cleavage. Can't you help me? She said quietly. Seconds of silence ticked away. Finally, Randall said, Come here. Sukiya hesitated, then went around the desk. Randall turned in his black leather chair to face her. He had stopped smiling. Kneel, he said. Kneel, he said again. Sukiya licked her lips. She pulled her hair back. Then her iPhone beeped. Excuse me, she told Randall. She pulled the phone out of the inside pocket of her Armani jacket, peered at the screen, and pressed some buttons. Randall frowned, and Sukiya held up a forefinger as she put the phone to her ear. Randall's lips thinned to a vicious line. More seconds passed. Finally, she turned back to him. I know you don't like technology, Randall, but it really is wonderful. She pressed a button on her iPhone. Randall's words from the speaker were distant but clear. Off the books. It's your fee for keeping your mouth shut about the methanol deal. Randall shot up from his chair, his expression that of a vengeful god, and Sukiya stepped back. Her phone held aloft like some strange device. Not only does it record, she said, it also emails. Randall stood as though held by invisible chains, breathing heavily. Sukiya nodded, seeing he understood that his incriminating voice now occupied some unknown bit of cyberspace. My pen, she said. Randall picked up the Tibaldi as though his hand had arthritis and passed it to her. Don't worry, Randall, don't worry. We'll face the coming storm together. Still holding her phone up, she walked to the window and hoisted herself onto the inside ledge, wriggling back into the recess. The marble was cool under her thighs. The city was spread beneath her, and the green-gray sea rippled beyond. Sukiya felt the warmth of the tropical sun through the thick plate glass as she leaned back. Come, Randall, she said. Come kneel before your mistress.